The first alarm came in at 2:14 a.m., when a security guard on K Street reported smoke of an unnatural color. That was how he phrased it, unnatural. The call was logged, transferred, and by the time the D.C. Fire Department trucks reached the edge of the Georgetown industrial strip, the sky above the river glowed a shade between copper and blood. The building was nondescript, a squat concrete storage facility belonging, officially, to the Federal Records Consolidation Service, a bureaucratic name that made no one curious. But tonight, it looked like a furnace. Flames poured from vents and cracks in the walls, feeding on something more volatile than mere paper. When the first team forced the doors open, the smell wasn't of burning wood or fuel oil, it was of chemicals and ink, and something bitterly metallic. Inside, the firefighters saw boxes collapsing in on themselves, lids bursting, contents scattering into ash. One shouted to another to cover the east side, but his voice was drowned by a deep, sudden explosion, like the building itself exhaled. Fragments of blackened folders rained down, some still legible for an instant before crumbling. Project Vanguard/Top Secret, Department of Defense Archives, eyes only. And then, as if on cue, two unmarked black sedans slid to a halt at the edge of the scene. Men in gray suits stepped out, their shoes glinting wet in the reflection of the fire. They didn't identify themselves, but the firefighters recognized the authority, the clipped tone, the refusal to answer questions. One of them barked, "Everyone out. Federal jurisdiction." As the last hose line was reeled back, a single firefighter lingered near the doorway, trying to rescue what looked like a sealed envelope half-burned but intact. He lifted it with his gloved hand, squinting at the red stamp that read, "Classified, Return to Bureau." He never saw the second explosion. It blew him backwards through the doorway, where the agents pulled him clear, ordered medical attention, and immediately began cordoning off the area. From across the street, half-shrouded in the orange flicker of emergency lights, a tall figure in a gray overcoat watched the chaos unfold. He stood perfectly still, hands in pockets, eyes reflecting the inferno. When a policeman turned to shout at him, the figure was gone, vanished into the alley behind the row of shuttered warehouses. By morning, the fire was declared contained. The building was a black shell. Local news called it an unfortunate accident, a short caused by faulty wiring. But within the Hoover building downtown, a different conversation was happening. Special Agent William Carver sat across from his superior, Assistant Director Mills, staring at a grainy black and white photograph of the ruins. "You're telling me," Carver said quietly, "that a federal storage facility filled with restricted materials just happened to go up in smoke the night before an audit?" Mills didn't answer. He leaned back, lit a cigarette, and said, "I'm telling you we're handling it internally. You're not assigned to this case, Bill." Carver smiled thinly. "Then why'd you call me in?" Mills exhaled. The smoke curled upward, ghostly in the stale light. "Because you have a reputation for reading fires the way other men read handwriting. And because we both know this doesn't look like bad wiring." Carver had been with the Bureau since the late 1950s, an arson profiler before the term existed. He had a gift for sensing when a blaze had purpose. "If you want me to walk away, say it," he said. "I want you to observe." Quietly, Mills replied. "And I want you to forget whatever you think you saw in that photograph." The site smelled of ozone and scorched ink even days later. Carver stood where the east wall had collapsed, notebook in hand. The fire patterns were wrong. There were 3 points of origin, not one. That meant accelerant. And beneath the ashes, traces of something unusual, molten plastic and melted film reels, like microfilm storage canisters. A local fire investigator approached him. "We found these," he said, handing Carver a handful of warped metal tags. Each was stamped with a serial number and the words, "Federal Records Division, Secure Storage." Carver turned one over. "You find any labels or documentation on what was stored here?" "Nothing readable. Place went up fast. Too fast." He crouched, running his gloved fingers over the blackened floor. The burn marks were circular, patterned, as if something had been placed deliberately and lit in sequence. This wasn't a fire of rage or carelessness. It was methodical. Professional. When he looked up, one of the men in suits, the same kind who'd arrived that night, was watching him from the perimeter. No badge, no nameplate. Just a nod that meant you're somewhere you shouldn't be. Carver rose slowly. Mind telling me which agency you're with? The man smiled faintly. You're looking at it, Agent Carver. Don't wander too deep. Then he turned and walked away. That evening, Carver poured himself a glass of bourbon in his small Adams Morgan apartment and read the preliminary fire report. The conclusion, electrical malfunction, probable. He laughed, short, humorless. He flipped through his notes. Multiple ignition points. Accelerant residues inconsistent with building materials. Presence of restricted documents. Immediate federal intervention. And one detail that hadn't made it into the official record, the firefighter's description before being sedated at Georgetown Memorial Hospital. The man had whispered, it wasn't just fire, there was someone inside. Someone inside. Carver leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Every instinct told him this wasn't arson for destruction, it was arson for erasure. Someone wanted something gone so completely it could never be reconstructed. He retrieved a file from his drawer, an old case from 1969, another accidental fire at a federal facility, also classified. The pattern was disturbingly similar. Back then, the paperwork mentioned reorganization of Cold War records. Now, 4 years later, it was happening again. At 11:47 p.m., Carver's phone rang. He hesitated before answering. Agent Carver? The voice was female, hushed. You don't know me, but you're looking at the Georgetown fire, aren't you? He paused. Who is this? I worked there. In the archives division. I saw what they were moving out before the fire. It wasn't wiring they were worried about, it was what was inside those boxes. What was inside? Silence for a long moment. Then, softly, documents that shouldn't exist. And I think they burned the wrong ones. The line clicked dead. Carver stared at the receiver, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to his jacket from the ruins. Outside, in the cool October night, someone lit a cigarette across the street and watched his window. The Georgetown sky, though calm now, still carried a faint, acrid haze, as if the city itself hadn't yet decided to let the fire die. 3 weeks after the Georgetown blaze, the air in Washington still carried a faint odor of char. It clung to the Potomac fog, to the marble steps of federal buildings, to every newspaper headline that mentioned electrical fault with suspicious brevity. Agent William Carver had spent those weeks chasing ashes, following the smallest inconsistencies, the missing serial tags, the burned microfilm fragments that no one in the bureau seemed to want catalogued. It was a Tuesday morning when the next alarm came in. This time, the address was different, a private waste disposal company in Arlington, Mid-Atlantic Industrial Processing Incorporated, a government-cleared contractor for document incineration. The irony wasn't lost on Carver. He arrived before the smoke had settled. The fire here had been surgical. The building's steel frame still stood, but the inner chambers, vaults and furnaces, were melted beyond recognition. Carver stood in the doorway, coat collar turned against the wind, watching a lone fire inspector sift through the debris. Third fire this quarter, the inspector said, shaking his head. You'd think someone out there's got a grudge against filing cabinets. Not filing cabinets, Carver murmured. Evidence. He crouched, running his hand over the ash near the blast center. Mixed into it were thin, curled strips of burned film, microfiche, likely. He pulled one from the dust, holding it up to the sunlight. A few letters still visible, Van. Guard. Carver froze. He'd seen that word before. Back at headquarters, he requested the contractor's federal file. It arrived half-redacted, as though someone had taken a razor blade to the truth. Still, there were enough fragments to piece together the outline. Mid-Atlantic Industrial Processing had been granted a restricted contract 6 months prior to dispose of obsolete Cold War documentation, Project Vanguard, Phase 4. Project Vanguard. He'd heard the whispers years ago, an early satellite reconnaissance initiative turned political weapon. Billions funneled into research, much of it vanishing into black budgets and untraceable shell companies. It was rumored to have crossed lines even the Pentagon didn't acknowledge: illegal domestic surveillance, biochemical experiments, offshore data laundering. If the files were being destroyed now, someone had decided history was too dangerous to preserve. He turned a page, scanning the signatures. One name repeated itself: Eleanor Avery, Archivist Grade 4. A note scrawled in the margin read, Contact terminated, September 14, 1973. The next day, Carver met her in the least likely place, the Library of Congress cafeteria. She sat alone at a corner table, a paper cup of tea trembling slightly in her hands. She looked younger than he expected, mid-30s, neat, alert eyes that darted to every doorway before settling on him. "You're the one who called," Carver said, sitting down. "I didn't give you my name." "No," he said. "You gave me enough to find it." She smiled faintly, as if both impressed and frightened by that fact. "Then you know I shouldn't be seen talking to you." "Neither should I," Carver replied. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Before the fire, they moved boxes out of the Georgetown site. I was told to relabel them for transfer to Mid-Atlantic. But when I checked the manifests, the serials didn't match any known storage inventory. They were off by 3 digits, codes used for suppressed holdings." "Suppressed," Carver repeated. "It means records that legally don't exist," she said. "Files that were ordered destroyed years ago. Only someone decided to store them instead. Then, suddenly, the order comes to incinerate them again, fast, no logs, no witnesses." Carver's pen hovered over his notebook. "Who issued the order?" She hesitated. "It came from inside the bureau." He looked up sharply. "Which division?" She met his eyes, her own steady now. "Yours." That night, Carver sat at his kitchen table staring at the file she had slipped him before they parted. It contained photocopies, scorched at the edges, but legible. One page read, "Project Vanguard, Budgetary Reallocation Summary. Subproject Echo 7, Behavioral Mapping Initiative. Domestic data collection via unauthorized channels. Directive, secure and destroy experimental logs by FI 1974. At the bottom, a signature, half-burned but unmistakable. Assistant Director Mills." Carver felt a slow, creeping chill. His superior, the same man who told him to stay clear, had signed the directive to destroy the very materials now going up in smoke. He poured himself another bourbon, his mind circling the implications. If Mills was involved, this wasn't a rogue arsonist. It was policy. He was about to pick up the phone when it rang first. "Agent Carver," said a smooth male voice. "I hear you've been speaking to a Miss Avery. That's ill-advised." "Who is this?" "Think of me as a friend," the voice replied. "One who prefers not to see his colleagues ruin their careers, or their health, over ghosts from the Cold War." Carver's jaw tightened. "You threatening me? I'm warning you. This case is closed. The next fire won't be a warehouse." The line went dead. The following morning, Nell Avery didn't show up for work. Her apartment was unlocked, her tea kettle still warm. On the counter lay a single photograph, partly burned, showing her standing beside a massive industrial furnace. Scribbled on the back, "They're not erasing the past. They're editing it." Carver stood in the silent apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He pocketed the photo and turned toward the door, only to notice a faint scorch mark on the wallpaper near the electrical outlet. Someone had tried to start a small fire there. It hadn't caught. He left the building with the distinct feeling he was being followed. Outside, a black car idled across the street, its windows too dark to see through. Carver began walking. His pulse quickened. Each turn of the corner, the car followed, never too close, never too far. When he stopped abruptly at a crosswalk, the car rolled past, and he caught a glimpse of a license plate ending in 314. Federal registration. He memorized it. That night, he couldn't sleep. He spread the recovered pages from Nell's file across his dining table, tracing connections with a pencil. Project Vanguard Operation Cold Ember Internal Disposal Directive Mills. At the bottom of the chain, he wrote one word in capital letters, "Why?" He stared at it until dawn. When the sun finally rose, Carver realized something that turned his stomach cold. Every location that had burned so far handled the same category of materials, satellite intelligence linked to domestic surveillance during the height of the Cold War. The people responsible weren't trying to hide a mistake. They were erasing evidence of a crime. And if Nell Avery had disappeared because she knew that, he was next. He poured coffee, opened his notebook, and under the word, "Why?" he wrote 3 more. Because they can burn truth. The next fire was different. Smaller, more precise, almost a signature. A low-rise government annex in Foggy Bottom went up in a neat, rectangular blaze that burned out in exactly 47 minutes. Long enough to erase the records inside, short enough to look like an accident. Carver arrived just before dawn. The fire trucks were still idling, their lights cutting through the thick gray smoke. A young lieutenant recognized him. "FBI? You people sure move fast these days," he said, coughing into his sleeve. Carver didn't answer. His eyes followed the pattern of the soot stains climbing the wall, a geometric spread, too uniform for random combustion. He crouched and drew a finger through the ash, revealing a faint grid of melted metal. Not shelving, wiring. Someone had rigged the fire from within. Inside the ruins, he found fragments of folders fused together. A few still had labels: Project Vanguard/Phase 3, Sanctioned, Restricted Distribution. And beneath them, an even stranger one, Echo 7 Personnel Testing. He pocketed the charred scraps, ignoring the stares of a pair of men in suits by the exit. They weren't firefighters. They weren't locals. And they didn't like that he was still there. By mid-morning, he was in his office, leaning over a corkboard littered with photographs of fire sites: Georgetown, Arlington, now Foggy Bottom. Each connected by red string and dates, forming a rough triangle across the map of Washington. 3 points. 3 sites tied to Vanguard. The Georgetown facility had handled microfilm storage. The Arlington contractor, document destruction. The Foggy Bottom annex, communications logs. Each represented one phase of record-keeping: creation, disposal, transmission. Someone wasn't burning random facilities. They were burning a system. He pulled an internal memo from the pile of files he'd quietly lifted from the archives. It was marked Confidential, Operations Support. Inside, tables of budgets and dates corresponded to each facility. And at the top of every column was the same code: C, Cold Ember. Carver's pulse quickened. He'd seen that name once before, buried in the footer of a classified report on internal investigations. Operation Cold Ember. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now it felt like the missing keystone. He scribbled a note to himself: Cold Ember equals internal cleanup. Burn old files. Burn old mistakes. But the pattern didn't end there. Each fire occurred within days of a congressional hearing or audit involving the intelligence community. The Georgetown blaze, 2 days before a defense appropriations review. The Arlington fire, 1 day after a leak to the Washington Post about illegal wiretaps. And Foggy Bottom, 3 days before a scheduled Senate subcommittee briefing on government transparency. Whoever the so-called Georgetown incinerator arsonist was, they had an impeccable sense of timing. That evening, Carver walked into the Bureau's records room with a folder marked Fire Analysis, Closed. The clerk barely looked up as he passed. Inside, shelves towered in neat, metallic rows, stretching into the dark like ribs of some vast beast. He pulled down a binder labeled Vanguard, Declassified Materials, and began flipping through the pages. Most of it was banal: technical specifications, launch data, funding allocations. But near the end, he found something that didn't belong: a list of civilian names. Next to each, Observation Complete, Destroy File. He recognized one immediately. Eleanor Avery. The rest of the list made his blood run cold. They weren't spies or defense employees. They were citizens, professors, journalists, analysts, people who had, at one time or another, criticized U.S. intelligence practices. Vanguard hadn't just looked outward at foreign enemies. It had turned inward. And someone wanted every trace of that erased. He was still staring at the list when the lights flickered. A voice echoed behind him. "Working late, Bill?" Carver turned. It was Mills, his superior, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and a faint, unreadable smile. "Doing what you told me," Carver said evenly. "Observing." "Observation's a funny thing," Mills said, stepping closer. "Sometimes it gets confused with interference." Carver closed the binder slowly. "If you wanted these files gone, you could have just said so." Mills' smile didn't falter. "You think I'm behind the fires. I think the fires are cleaning up a mess that traces back to you." "Careful," Mills said softly. "That sounds like insubordination." Carver's jaw tightened. "And conspiracy sounds like treason." The two men stood in silence, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space between them. Finally, Mills turned and walked away. At the door, he said without looking back, "Go home, Bill. The past doesn't burn quietly." Carver didn't go home. Instead, he drove across town to a small diner on Wisconsin Avenue, the kind that stayed open for insomniacs and cops on night shift. The waitress poured his coffee without asking. He sat in the corner booth, staring at the rain-streaked window. The reflection in the glass showed his own face, lined, exhausted, and behind it, the faint glint of a car parked under a street lamp. Black sedan. Same as before. He pretended not to notice. He unfolded the list of names again. Avery's name sat there like a ghost. He traced it with his thumb and whispered, "What did you know, Nell?" A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, the bell above the diner door. Someone entered. Carver didn't look up until a man slid into the booth opposite him without invitation. He was middle-aged, clean-cut, wearing a beige trench coat that still dripped from the rain. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. "From a friend," he said. "Who?" The man smiled thinly. "The kind who doesn't like fires." Carver opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, a surveillance shot of the Foggy Bottom facility 2 days before the fire. A truck in the background bore the insignia, Federal Courier Service. But beneath it, faintly visible, was a second logo, stenciled over and half erased, CE. Cold Ember. When Carver looked up, the man was gone. He spent the rest of the night in his apartment, cross-referencing the photograph against transport logs. None of the trucks were registered under that company name. It didn't exist. But the serial number painted on the vehicle matched one from a Bureau motor pool requisition list. Someone within the FBI was directly moving materials to each site before the fires. He sat back, rubbing his temples. "So there's no arsonist," he muttered. "Just handlers." At 3:12 a.m., his phone rang again. A voice he didn't recognize whispered, "They burned Phase 3 last night. Phase 4 is next. You're already on their list." "Who is this?" "You're looking in the wrong direction, Agent Carver. Stop staring at the flames. Ask who lights the match." The line went dead, leaving only the sound of his own pulse. He turned to his board of photographs, the triangle of fire sites still pinned in place. Slowly, he added a fourth pin, at the Bureau's own storage annex in Rock Creek Park. The next target. As dawn broke, he drove there, parked under the trees, and sat watching the building's windows glimmer with the reflection of morning sun. Somewhere inside, he imagined men already packing boxes, sealing envelopes, preparing the next accident. He took a deep breath, opened his notebook, and wrote. Observation, 3 fires. Same pattern. Same internal access. Hypothesis, Operation Cold Ember, Federal Directive for Destruction of Incriminating Materials under Guise of Containment. Next target, Rock Creek Annex. Status, active. He closed the notebook, his decision made. If he couldn't stop the next fire, he would at least expose it. But as he started the car, a faint smell drifted through the air, smoke. Not from the annex. From his own glove compartment. He yanked it open. Inside, his notebook, smoldering. A small, neat flame eating through his notes. Someone had already been there. And they had left a message written in the soot on his windshield. Stop looking, Bill. You'll only find ashes. Carver didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment, staring at the scorched remains of his notebook, tracing the faint impressions the fire had left on the paper. Every word he'd written, every connection he'd drawn, was now at the mercy of someone who didn't want the truth exposed. Whoever they were, they had access, resources, and patience. And most terrifyingly, they had anticipated him. He had 2 choices, retreat or keep pressing forward. Carver had never been one to retreat. The next morning, he found a note slipped under his apartment door, typed on cheap office stationery. Meet me at the back of the Jefferson Memorial. Midnight. Come alone. Bring nothing but your eyes. No signature, no return address. He spent the day reviewing the remaining evidence he had salvaged. The burned microfilm from Georgetown. The partial Vanguard logs from Arlington. The surveillance photo of the Foggy Bottom truck. And one fragment of paper Nell Avery had left behind, the burned but legible corner that read, "They're not burning history. They're erasing it." At midnight, he parked near the Jefferson Memorial. Fog rolled across the tidal basin, carrying the scent of wet stone and river water. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, moving with purpose. Carver's hand instinctively went to the gun at his hip. "Agent Carver," said a voice, soft but urgent. "Nell," he whispered. She stepped forward, tall, steady, the faint glint of moonlight on her glasses. Her coat was buttoned tightly, but her hands were shaking slightly. She handed him a folder sealed with a paperclip. "I don't have much time," she said. "They know I talked to you. They'll come for me. You need to see this." Inside were photocopies of partially burned documents, the same type he'd been tracking for weeks, but what made him pause was the content. Names. Dates. Orders. Each page documented an internal bureau operation he hadn't known existed, Operation Cold Ember. Phase 1, she said, was Georgetown. Phase 2, Arlington. Phase 3, Foggy Bottom. But Phase 4. Carver looked up, frowning. Rock Creek? She nodded. The Bureau's own storage facility. They're planning the next fire. They want to make sure nothing survives. Anything that even hints at misconduct gets destroyed. Carver leaned back against the marble wall of the memorial, the wind tugging at his coat. So this isn't just an arsonist. It's internal. Someone inside the FBI is orchestrating all of this. Yes, Nell whispered. And I think they might be watching us right now. Her voice trembled slightly as she added, "I've seen some of the people who pulled the trucks. I've seen the men who came to burn files in Arlington and Foggy Bottom. They're bureau agents. Your bureau. And," she paused, swallowing hard. "Your partner is involved." Carver's stomach dropped. His partner, Tom Harlan, had been with him for over a decade. Loyal, methodical, competent. And now, possibly a participant in what could only be described as a federal cover-up. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I didn't want to believe it either," Nell said. "But I've followed the paper trail. The authorizations, the truck manifests, all of it points to him. And if you go to the Rock Creek Annex, you'll see Phase 4 in progress." They were silent for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves across the memorial grounds. Then she said, softly but with conviction, "I can't go with you. Not tonight. But you have to stop them, or they'll make sure everything, including me, disappears." Before Carver could protest, she melted into the shadows, leaving only the faint trace of her perfume and the crumpled folder in his hands. Carver didn't wait until morning. He drove straight to Rock Creek, avoiding main roads, keeping his headlights low. The facility looked ordinary from the outside, gray and unremarkable, the kind of building that could easily hide a furnace capable of erasing decades of history. He parked in the shadows and observed. A black sedan, identical to the one that had followed him weeks ago, was stationed near the entrance. Figures in gray suits moved like ghosts, loading boxes into trucks marked with faded government seals. Carver's heart pounded as he recognized one of the men, Harlan. His partner was directing the operation, clipboard in hand, making notes on each box loaded. Carver watched from the trees, fury and disbelief battling for control. Harlan hadn't just participated, he was leading. Carver considered confronting him but realized the danger. One wrong move, and the next fire could include him. Instead, he took photographs from the shadows, documenting what he could. The evidence was damning, enough to expose the operation if it ever reached the right hands. As he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye. From the perimeter, a man in a dark overcoat approached, walking deliberately, unhurried. Carver froze. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, voice calm, almost bored. Carver instinctively reached for his gun. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "I'm someone who knows how this ends. And Agent Carver," he paused, letting the name linger. "The more you dig, the closer you get to disappearing yourself." Carver felt the weight of the threat, but he refused to show fear. "I'm not stopping. Not until people know the truth." The man tilted his head. "Truth is messy. Ashes are tidy. That's why they prefer it." Before Carver could respond, the man vanished into the darkness, leaving only the faint smell of smoke lingering in the damp night air. 2 days later, Nell Avery resurfaced in the most unlikely way, through a local journalist she trusted. A small, discreet article appeared in the Washington Post, cryptic but pointed. Confidential records from Cold War initiatives may have been intentionally destroyed in a series of fires across D.C., raising questions about internal bureau oversight. Sources insist the scope of these operations is larger than publicly acknowledged. The article was quickly retracted, replaced by an official statement, "All fires under investigation, no evidence of wrongdoing by federal agencies." Carver stared at the screen in disbelief. The game had changed. The story was out, even if only for a moment, but the power that erased it was clearly watching. And Nell? She had vanished again, leaving Carver with the folder, the photographs, and a sinking realization, she might already be dead. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid burning like fire in his chest. His reflection in the glass stared back, grim and resolute. The pattern was clear now. 3 fires confirmed, 1 in progress, and a network of insiders orchestrating each step. Phase 4 would be the most dangerous yet. He didn't know if he could stop it, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let it continue unchallenged. Even if it meant facing his own partner. And even if it meant stepping into a fire he couldn't walk out of. Carver's apartment smelled faintly of smoke still, a lingering reminder of the small fire that had consumed his notebook weeks earlier. He didn't try to air it out. The scent had become a kind of warning, a personal talisman that reminded him how close the flames could get. It was a rainy Wednesday when he received the envelope, thin, unmarked, no return address. He recognized it immediately as a warning, or perhaps a gift. Inside, a single strip of microfilm rested on a stiff piece of cardboard. Stamped across the top in block letters were the words, "Vanguard, redacted, White House eyes only." Carver's hands shook as he held it. The strip was partially burned at one corner, though enough remained intact to see its contents, a list of covert operations, dates, and names, some familiar, some disturbing. And then, at the very bottom, in handwriting he recognized instantly, a single note. Phase 4 in motion. They're watching. Stay silent. The handwriting, it was Mills. Carver's pulse accelerated. His mind ran through all the options, all the people who could have intercepted him without his knowledge. Every instinct told him that the Bureau itself, his superiors, his colleagues, his closest partners, was involved in a cleanup operation far larger than he had imagined. By noon, he realized the extent of the danger. The microfilm alone was enough to make him a target. He knew it wouldn't take much for someone to decide that he was the next problem to erase. He left his apartment carefully, leaving no trace of where he was going. Every corner of Adams Morgan felt surveilled, every shadow seemed to shift with intent. By mid-afternoon, he had parked in a deserted lot near the National Archives. The place he now realized would be central to the next stage of Operation Cold Ember. Carver retrieved his notebook from a secure lockbox he'd installed in his trunk. He carefully reconstructed what little he could, locations, dates, names, and connections between Phase 1 through 4. Each fire, he now understood, had been meticulously orchestrated. Someone inside the Bureau had managed not only the destruction of documents but the perception that it was random arson. And now, that someone had decided to send him a message. Late that evening, Carver noticed a black sedan parked a block away from his car. Unmarked. He had seen this vehicle before, 2 nights ago, watching him as he left the Jefferson Memorial, weeks ago, near Rock Creek. He stepped into the shadows, careful not to be seen, and followed the car as it moved silently through the wet streets. It led him to an industrial lot just outside D.C., where crates were being unloaded from a van with official-looking seals. Carver crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets, taking photographs with a small camera he kept for such occasions. Inside the crates were boxes marked classified, Vanguard Phase 4. And then, the impossible. He saw one of the men he trusted most, Tom Harlan, directing the operation, clipboard in hand. The realization struck Carver like a physical blow. His partner, his friend, had become part of the Arsonist network. The vehicles began moving again, heading toward a warehouse at Rock Creek Park. Carver trailed them at a distance, careful not to be seen. His mind raced. Phase 4 is now underway. If they succeed, nothing remains of Vanguard Phase 4 except ashes. Back at his apartment later that night, Carver tried to make sense of it all. The microfilm, the photographs, the burned files, they weren't just evidence. They were a map of complicity, pointing directly toward a network of rogue agents within the Bureau. Then, the phone rang. "Agent Carver?" A hushed voice spoke. "You're getting close. Too close. Step back." "Who is this?" Carver demanded. "No one you know," the voice said. "You have no idea how far it goes. You need to leave the city. Now. They'll come for you. Carver pressed the receiver harder. Who are you? Who sent you? There was a pause. Then, they did. And they're already inside your office. Click. Carver froze. His office. At FBI headquarters. His heart pounded as he realized the fire wasn't just outside. It was inside. Inside the bureau, inside the city, inside the very walls that were supposed to protect him. 2 days later, Carver arrived at the Rock Creek Annex before dawn. He stayed hidden in the surrounding woods, binoculars trained on the building. Lights flickered through the windows, a steady, programmed illumination that suggested meticulous planning. Inside, boxes were being moved again, Phase 4, the final purge. And then he saw them. Men in gray suits, armed and alert. Vehicles stamped with official seals carried away crates and paper bundles. Every movement was synchronized. Every step calculated. Carver's stomach sank. These weren't arsonists operating alone. This was an internal operation, a purge carried out by agents who had taken it upon themselves to decide what history would remember. He tried to call Mills. No answer. He tried Harlan. The line was dead. And as he realized the extent of isolation, his gut twisted. They were surrounding him, even before he had stepped inside. Carver knew there was only one way forward. If he wanted to stop Phase 4, or even survive to expose it, he had to move fast, and he had to trust no one. Not the Bureau. Not his partner. Not the invisible watchers who whispered threats through phones and shadows. He took a deep breath, pocketed the microfilm, and prepared for what he knew would be a confrontation unlike any he had faced before. The fire wasn't just destroying documents, it was destroying lives. And he was next in line. That night, in the dark alley near his apartment, a shadow moved with deliberate caution. Someone was watching. Carver noticed a faint smell of smoke, the same chemical tang that had haunted him since Georgetown. A match flickered briefly, illuminating a man's face in the gloom, a face he didn't recognize, but one that exuded authority and danger. The man spoke softly, almost conversationally. "Agent Carver, the next fire won't be a building." Carver's blood ran cold. He realized then that the internal fire wasn't just metaphorical. It was literal. And it was coming for him. The morning after the alley encounter, Carver barely slept. Every creak of his apartment, every distant siren, every soft footstep outside his window felt like a countdown. The microfilm he carried was no longer just a piece of evidence, it was a beacon. Whoever had orchestrated the fires knew it existed. Whoever had orchestrated the fires also knew he knew. He had no one to turn to. Mills and Harlan were both implicated. Nell Avery was missing. And whispers from the shadows had confirmed one terrifying truth: the arsonist wasn't a person. The arsonist was a directive, a division inside the FBI executing a secret purge. Carver needed proof. He spent the day driving to obscure bureau archives, avoiding main streets, ducking into public libraries, anything to cross-reference internal memos with the microfilm. He finally found it, a document stamped top secret, internal distribution only, buried in the files of a defunct security office. The memo was concise, chilling, and impossible to ignore. Operation Cold Ember. Authorized, Senior Bureau Division. Purpose, removal and destruction of sensitive Cold War intelligence records. Scope, Vanguard Phases 1 to 4, including classified domestic surveillance operations. Execution, incineration of all identified materials, obstruction of external disclosure, plausible deniability for agency oversight. Carver read the page over and over. It wasn't just a suggestion. It wasn't a rogue agent. This was sanctioned. Inside the FBI, a faction had decided which documents would live and which would die, and they were cleaning house with fire. The memo included detailed instructions, vehicles, storage locations, transport schedules, even contingency plans in case the operation was compromised. Every fire he had tracked over the past months was listed, along with names, agents, supervisors, and logistical staff. And there, at the very bottom, was a handwritten note. All personnel involved are cleared. Watch the observers. They may become liabilities. Carver's chest tightened. Observers. That meant him. The next phase wasn't just the fire, they were coming for the witness. He left the archives carefully, keeping the microfilm hidden in an inner pocket. His senses were on high alert. Somewhere in the streets of D.C., men were tracking him, monitoring his moves. Each turn of a corner, each passing shadow felt like confirmation that the Bureau itself had planted eyes everywhere. That evening, as he approached a diner in Georgetown, his gut told him he was being followed. Sure enough, a black sedan idled across the street. He ducked into an alley, circling behind, and caught the driver's reflection in a puddle. Unmarked, professional, unmistakably Bureau personnel. Inside, his mind raced. Phase 4 at Rock Creek wasn't just the next target, it was the ultimate test. The memo indicated that anyone who witnessed the destruction or tried to interfere would be neutralized. Carver realized, grimly, that the fires were a smokescreen, the real danger was internal. That night, Carver returned to his apartment to find it ransacked. His furniture overturned, drawers emptied, and a faint chemical smell lingered in the air, the same chemical odor he'd noted at Georgetown and Arlington. Whoever had been there had gone carefully, looking for the microfilm. The absence of obvious signs of forced entry suggested one thing: inside access. He ducked into his bedroom, scanning the room. In the faint light from the street lamp outside, he noticed a small, crisp envelope placed deliberately on his desk. No fingerprints, no markings. Inside, a single sheet of paper read, "You should have stayed out of it. The next fire will not spare witnesses. Step away, or the Bureau will make sure you join the ashes." Carver folded the note, tucking it into his coat. His mind worked quickly. There was only one way to survive this phase: go off-grid and strike back with information no one could erase. 3 nights later, he made his move. Using his knowledge of internal operations from the Cold Ember memo, he staked out Rock Creek. The Bureau's own vehicles, crates, and personnel moved with surgical precision. Carver crouched behind a grove of trees, photographing every truck, every agent, every box marked Vanguard Phase 4. Suddenly, a flare of movement, a spotlight sweeping across the grounds. Carver dove to the ground as a figure approached the tree line. A low voice called out, "Agent Carver, come out. We know you're there." Carver pressed himself further into the shadows, heart racing. Another figure stepped into view, hand raised. It was Mills. Not hostile yet, but impossibly calm. "You shouldn't be here," Mills said. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand perfectly," Carver shot back. "You're destroying evidence. You're burning the truth. And I won't let you do it to Phase 4. Mills' gaze hardened. "Phase 4 is containment. If you interfere, you'll be treated as a threat to national security." Carver weighed his options. A direct confrontation could end in death. Yet retreat meant letting an entire network of documents, files, and proof disappear into flames. He pulled a small camera from his coat, snapping photos of the trucks, the agents, the crates. Every angle, every label, every movement, captured. Suddenly, an explosion roared from inside the building, a controlled detonation to test the furnaces, Carver realized. Sparks flew, smoke filled the night, and chaos erupted as agents scrambled. Carver used the moment to slip behind the trucks, narrowly avoiding detection, and vanished into the woods. By the time the smoke cleared, the operation was intact, but Carver carried something the Bureau could never erase: evidence of internal complicity in real time. That night, safe for the moment in a cheap motel outside the city, Carver reviewed the photos. Every fire, every agent, every crate, every vehicle, documented. The Cold Ember memo, paired with these photographs, was enough to expose the operation publicly. And yet, one truth weighed heavier than all the evidence: the network behind the fires was vast, calculated, and willing to eliminate anyone who posed a threat. Carver was now squarely in their crosshairs. He lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. Outside, rain began to fall, washing the streets clean of the week's debris, but not of the smoke in his mind. The internal fire had begun. And now, Carver was inside it. Carver had always believed that exposing the truth required patience, caution, and precise evidence. By now, he had all three. The Cold Ember memo, the photographs from Rock Creek, and the scattered remnants of Phase 1 through 3 fires formed a damning chain of proof. But Washington, D.C., in the mid-1970s was a city where the line between justice and cover-up blurred like smoke over the Potomac. It was mid-November when he first contacted the Senate aide, a young staffer named Robert Hayes, known for his integrity and quiet courage. Carver met him in a dimly lit office just off Capitol Hill, papers spread across the table. He laid out the evidence, step by step, the fires, the burned microfilm, the internal memo, the vehicles, the agents, even Harlan's presence at Rock Creek. Hayes ran his fingers over the memo. This proves internal sanctioning, he said, voice barely above a whisper. If this gets out, it could unravel the Bureau. The White House. Congress, everyone involved. Carver nodded. That's the point. People need to know what's been happening while we pretend these are isolated arsons. Hayes paused. You're asking me to whistleblow on the FBI itself. On operations that have been sanctioned at the highest level. Are you sure you understand what that means? Carver's jaw tightened. I understand perfectly. But silence is complicity. I won't be complicit. The following morning, as Carver reviewed his photographs again, he noticed a subtle pattern he had missed in his first analysis. Every time the Bureau conducted one of these internal burns, an external fire conveniently mirrored it days later. Georgetown. Arlington. Foggy Bottom. Rock Creek. Now, after the memo leak, a small warehouse near the Navy Yard went up in flames. It wasn't just coincidence. Someone was creating a distraction, a smoke screen to obscure the truth while real evidence was being destroyed elsewhere. Carver realized, grimly, that Operation Cold Ember wasn't limited to the sites he had tracked. It was a network of fires, carefully coordinated to conceal systemic misconduct across multiple federal agencies. And each fire came with an implicit warning: we can burn anything, even history itself. At the Senate hearing, Hayes presented what Carver had provided, carefully redacted for safety, but enough to make waves. The room was tense, the air thick with skepticism. Bureau representatives denied everything, claiming no knowledge of internal purges. Yet, the evidence hinted otherwise, and the murmurs of disbelief rippled through the chamber. Then, halfway through the session, an unexpected explosion rattled the building. Smoke filled the hearing room. Evacuations ensued. The media rushed to report a malfunction in the Senate Annex electrical system, but Carver and Hayes recognized it immediately. Phase 4 was in motion. The fires were no longer confined to archives, they were targeting oversight itself. Outside, news helicopters captured clouds of smoke drifting over D.C., forming a surreal backdrop as senators and staffers struggled to maintain order. Carver, crouched behind a pillar, felt a sinking realization. Operation Cold Ember had escalated from document destruction to intimidation and obstruction of justice. The scandal didn't remain hidden for long. Headlines exploded across national newspapers. Senate Annex evacuated amid unexplained fire. Is the Bureau burning its secrets? Whistleblower claims government arson program targeting Cold War records. Who is the Georgetown incinerator arsonist? Yet, amid the chaos, one detail emerged that stunned Carver. Every account of the fires referred to a singular culprit, an unknown arsonist dubbed the Georgetown incinerator arsonist. The press, the public, and even internal Bureau reports treated it as one person, never suspecting that the fires were coordinated, planned, and executed by a network of agents and internal operations. Carver realized the terrifying truth: the arsonist was a fiction, a convenient scapegoat designed to focus attention away from the Bureau's own complicity. They had created a legend to hide themselves. Days later, Nell Avery resurfaced in the most improbable way. She appeared at a public library on Capitol Hill, handing copies of partially burned files to a reporter who had been quietly investigating the fires. She had been hiding, moving through safe houses, dodging anyone who could report her. Her eyes were sunken, her face pale, but her determination burned brighter than ever. "Bill," she whispered to Carver when they met briefly, "the public doesn't know the arsonist isn't real. They think it's a lone criminal. But it's not. The Bureau made the legend. Every fire, every missing record, every death, they're the arsonist." Carver's hands clenched the folder she passed him. "So the fires weren't the crime," he said, voice low. "The fires were the cover-up." "Yes," she said. "And Phase 5 is coming. They've already decided who they can silence next." The next fire, weeks later, destroyed part of the church committee's investigative archives. Carver watched from a distance, helpless as critical documents vanished in flames. The operation had now extended beyond mere files. It was systematically erasing oversight itself. In private, he began to wonder, had the Bureau ever intended to let the truth survive? Or had Cold Ember been the mechanism all along, to ensure that no record of domestic surveillance, illegal operations, or political manipulation ever saw the light of day? As he pieced the pattern together, a realization struck him like ice, that Georgetown incinerator arsonist was not a person at all. It was an idea, a code, a sanctioned method of silencing history. The fires, the threats, the disappearances, they were all part of a single, terrifying system, one that stretched from Georgetown to the highest levels of the Bureau. And Carver had become the next target. That night, in a dimly lit motel room, he spread the photographs, memos, and microfilm across the bed. Each document was a fragment of truth. Together, they told a story no one wanted to hear, but one Carver was determined to preserve. He picked up the microfilm and whispered to himself, almost as if speaking aloud could make it real. They created the arsonist. They burned the past. But they can't burn this. Outside, rain fell over Washington, the clouds reflecting the faint glow of distant fires. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, the Bureau watched, waiting to see if Carver would survive. He knew the next move would be the most dangerous yet. The internal fire had consumed too much already, and he was now trapped in its center. Yet one thought kept him going: the truth was alive, even if everything else was ash. By December, Washington D.C. was cloaked in cold fog, the Potomac a gray ribbon reflecting the city's muted lights. Carver had gone off-grid. Motel rooms, alleyway rendezvous, borrowed typewriters, he had transformed into a ghost, carrying the last pieces of evidence that could expose the truth behind Operation Cold Ember. Every fire, every missing document, every internal directive, he had them all. He had not seen Harlan or Mills in weeks. Contact was impossible. Nell Avery, his only living ally, remained in hiding, leaving him messages through secret channels. Each note was more urgent than the last: Phase 5 is coming. They know who you are. They are preparing to erase you. Carver had a plan. If he could get the documents into the hands of a trustworthy journalist or a congressional aide outside the Bureau's reach, the operation could be exposed. But he also knew the risks. He was no longer just a witness. He had become a target. On Christmas Eve, Carver returned to Georgetown. The streets were deserted, the chill cutting through his coat. He moved cautiously toward the skeletal remains of the original storage facility. The site had been cordoned off for months, ostensibly as unsafe due to structural damage. In reality, it was a monument to the beginning of the Bureau's internal purge. Carver crouched behind the charred walls, scanning the lot. A single black sedan idled near the perimeter. His pulse quickened. He had seen this car countless times before. He knew the driver without seeing his face. A voice called from the shadows, "Bill Carver." He froze. The figure stepped forward. It was Mills. Calm, composed, almost paternal in demeanor, but with an edge sharp enough to cut steel. "You've been busy," Mills said. "Collecting evidence, following leads, putting yourself at risk. I have to ask, why?" "Because someone has to stop this," Carver said. "These fires aren't accidents. They're purges. Internal cleanup. People have died. Documents have vanished. The Bureau has lied to the public for years." Mill's expression didn't change. "And you think you can expose it? Do you know what that will do to the country? The Bureau? The intelligence community?" Carver swallowed hard. "The public deserves to know. History deserves to survive." Mills shook his head slowly. "History is written by those who survive, Bill. And you might not survive this." He stepped closer, the faint smell of smoke clinging to him. "You're in over your head," he said, almost gently. "Leave it alone." Carver raised the microfilm and the photographs. "I can't." Mills studied him, the faintest flicker of admiration in his eyes. Then, with a final nod, he turned and vanished into the shadows. Carver exhaled slowly. He was alone, but he had the proof. The final step was to transmit the evidence. Carver knew he could never return to his apartment, never walk openly in the streets again. He arranged a secret meeting with a journalist known for integrity and persistence. Late at night, in a quiet parking garage, he passed over the microfilm, photographs, and the Cold Ember memo. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked. "Yes," the journalist said. "And you trust me to publish it?" "I have to," Carver said. If I die before it's exposed, the fires win. Weeks later, a partial declassification of Operation Cold Ember hit the news. The headline was understated but shocking. FBI admits past internal purges of Cold War documents. The report revealed that multiple storage facilities had been burned under sanctioned directives, targeting materials deemed too sensitive to survive. It also noted that oversight had been obstructed by internal personnel, though names were redacted. Public outrage followed, but the biggest revelation, the identity of the so-called Georgetown incinerator arsonist, remained classified. In the shadows, Carver watched from a distance. He had survived, but only barely. He knew the Bureau's network was still intact, still watching. Yet a small measure of satisfaction warmed him. For the first time, the country knew something about the truth hidden in the ashes. And then the twist, the scandal that would never fully be declassified. The Georgetown incinerator arsonist was never one person. It was a code name used internally by a network of agents across multiple phases of Project Vanguard, sanctioned by the Bureau itself. The Arsonist had been a fiction, a convenient story to hide systemic destruction of evidence that implicated the United States in domestic surveillance and Cold War abuses. Carver closed his eyes. For years, he had chased a ghost through flames, only to find that the ghost had been orchestrated by the very institution he served. Nell Avery's voice echoed in his memory. They're not burning history. They're erasing it. Carver looked at the city skyline, smoke faintly rising from distant factories. The fires were gone, but the legacy of Cold Ember remained, a cautionary tale of power, secrecy, and the price of truth. He slipped quietly into the night, a man who had survived the internal fire, carrying the knowledge that sometimes, the arsonist isn't a single hand with a match, it's an entire system designed to control history itself. And the ashes? They told the story that no one dared to speak aloud. The story closes with a lingering question. How many truths were still smoldering, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them?